Hello friends and chess friends, welcome back to the channel. It's the 27th of April and what do Dutch people do then? Celebrate King's Day. What do I do? On this day, watch the 13th game of the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Liren. And what a game we had yesterday to start with. Game 12, Nepo was in the lead, had a winning advantage, but spoiled it and eventually lost. The match is 6-6 right now, two more classical games, and today we have game 13. Nepo with the white pieces. Let's see if he is able to recover from the disappointing result from yesterday. He opens the game with 1e4, as expected, as he had been playing throughout the match anyway. e4, e5, Ding also sticks to his main repertoire, and we get again to see an Ruy Lopez opening. So all has been tried before in the match. Remember, in game 1, Nepo decided to trade the bishop for the knight, but his main repertoire for the match is based on this move d3. And after b5, the bishop comes back to b3, d6, and now, well, one of the main ideas of black here is to play knight a5. In game 5 of the match, Nepo played the move c3, but in game 11, he went here for the move a3. That move a3 didn't bring him that much, so he decided to come back to the move c3. Black castles, and now h3. Bishop b7, and now it's Nepo, interestingly enough, to deviate from the lines from the game we have seen in game 5. In that game, he followed up here with a4, with the idea that after knight a5, the bishop could stay on this active diagonal, dropping back to a2. But for this occasion, he decides differently, and he comes with a remarkable new idea, the move bishop e3, which is kind of an uncommon way of developing in this opening, because normally you would expect the knight to come to d2 straight away, and then rook e1, the knight comes around to the king side, and later on you will decide what to do with his bishop. But for this occasion, okay, he goes for bishop e3, knight a5 played anyway, and after bishop c2, white of course doesn't want to surrender its light squared bishop, black follows up with the move c5, trying to increase its influence in the center. And only now Nepo plays here the move knight bd2. So all the pieces are developed, but the big question is that bishop on e3 that useful? Ding played here the move rook e8, very typical idea, so that you're preparing to come back with the bishop to f8. And it should be clear that white is probably not advised to play d4 too quickly, because in that case all the pawns can be swapped in the center, and then it's knight takes d4 followed by bishop f8, and the rook is very nicely placed on the half open file, attacking the pawn on e4. And well, you may think that the pawn on d6 is also a weakness, but white is not really attacking it. And white has some problems defending the pawn on e4, because for instance, if you would play f3, which is the ideal move, that runs into the move d5. Excellent idea, highlighting the vulnerability of the bishop on e3. So Nepo postpones the decision on what to do in the center. He starts here with the move a4, which doesn't really threaten anything yet, but of course there are always ideas to take on b5, followed by the exchange of rooks in case the knight comes back to c6, which is a very likely scenario. But black is for a big choice here. And the normal move would be to play bishop f8, so that the rook is overprotecting the pawn on e5. But then, well, if black does get a chance, he will play d5, and the position is quite nice. But I think the reason why Ding refrained from playing this move is thanks to this bishop on e3, he can now even consider playing bishop g5 again. And Nepo had been trying these sort of setups earlier in the match as well. The idea is to trade off the bishop for the knight, and then following it up with this typical plan of rook e1, knight f1, knight e3, trying to gain control over the light squares. And that kind of scenario, it's probably something Ding got fed up with, and instead he decided to play this prophylactical move h6 to stop all this bishop g5 ideas, and well, the move bishop f8 will be played anyway, but it does make sense to keep that knight on the board. But what is white supposed to do now? Well, I think basically the only plan here is try to get in d4 straight away, or eventually prepare it by taking first on b5. In the game, Nepo decided to play d4. So if white does get a chance, he would like to push the pawn up to d5 so that the bishop on b7 remains out of play. The knight from a5 cannot return. So therefore e takes d4 on the board, c takes d4. And now typical plan here, c takes d4. Black is willing to allow a pawn weakness on d6. But once again, it's not a real weakness if you're unable to attack it. And after knight takes d4, looks as if white is a bit better, but frankly I don't think that's really the case. In fact, black is quite active, with potentially quite some play against that pawn on e4. Knight c4 was played. That's also another interesting idea. There's no need to drop back to c6 instead, and this is a more active way, with the main idea trying to exchange that knight on d2, removing a defender of the pawn on e4. And well, it looks as if white could take on b5 now, but that allows knight takes e3, and these double pawns in the middle of the board, they're really ugly. After a takes b5, white can win the pawn by taking on b5 with a knight, but after rook takes a1, queen takes a1, black has a very nice resource in the form of the move d5. And here, thanks to this move, black liberates its position, especially the bishop, which can come to c5 to attack the pawn on e3, eyeing the white king. And of course, one of the main points is that e takes d5 is a huge mistake, as it runs into queen takes d5 with a huge mating threat, as well as the knight on b5 is hanging as well. So white should stay away from that pawn on b5. Maybe what could have been a better idea, if we go back a couple of moves, is that instead of playing d4, white may have started with a move a takes b5. And if we do follow the same plan, let's say we go d4, e takes d4, c takes d4, pawn takes, knight takes. In case you do play knight c4 right now, white is able to take it. Rook takes a1, queen takes a1, b takes c4. So there is this pressure against the pawn on e4, but thanks to the move bishop a4, it is white who is starting to develop an initiative, forcing the rook to go away. But then also the move bishop c6 is a nice way to defend against the pawn on e4. And white has a bit of an initiative in that case, although it's probably still very equal. Let's get back to the game, as consciously Nepo refrained from capturing on b5. And after knight c4, rather than taking that pawn, he took on c4 straight away. But then there's b takes c4. And, well, you can argue that this move a4, if you didn't really take on b5, it's not that useful, of course. So here, interesting moment, because the pawn on e4 is under threat, and white has to figure out what to do with that pawn. Because if you do protect it one more time with queen f3, for instance, there is bishop f8, and that doesn't really solve the problems. The pawn is 3 times attacked and only twice defended. I think the opening was not a big success for Nepo, and he probably started to realize it around this point. He played the move f3 to protect the pawn, but now bishop f8 was blitzed out by Ding. Very good move. The bishop is fine there, and it does open the diagonal. Sorry, the file for the rook. And white wanted to do something about that unprotected bishop and decided to drop back to f2. The alternative is bishop f4, but then d5 is going to be played anyway. The big difference between going back to f2 and going forward with bishop f4 is that now e5 is a possibility, so that the bishop protects the pawn. But after knight d7, the pawn is vulnerable, and black has very simple play in the form of bishop c5, queen b6, increasing the pressure on this knight, and it looks as if black has a very stable edge. So instead the bishop went back to f2, but now d5 on the board. And there's no chance to advance the pawn. It can just be taken by the rook. So e takes d5 and now knight takes d5. And here the center has been cleared. It's an open game. And how to evaluate this position. And if you purely look at the pawn formation, you see this is an isolated pawn on c4. It could potentially be a weakness. But I believe that black's pieces are more active, particularly the rook on the e file. It's very nice. And therefore, white played here the move bishop e4 to close the file for the rook. And putting a bit of pressure on this diagonal, at least preventing the knight from jumping around. And I think that's what black should have been trying to do instead of the move he played in the game. There followed rook e5, but frankly speaking, I don't really see what the rook is going to do there. It's overprotecting the knight on d5, but it's also vulnerable in the middle of the board. And a move I like better here, which is probably difficult to spot, it's the move rook b8. Placing the rook on the half-open file, and then we can see that the pawn on b2 is a potential target. And an additional idea now is to move the knight either to f4 or b4 and forcing the exchange of light squared bishops. And that would be a very nice trade because from f4 or b4 the knight is able to come in to d3 while the rook on the b file would be very nicely placed. I think this would have posed a lot of problems for white. But in the game, rook e5 was played. White played rook c1, attacking the pawn on c4, and now rook c8. But then you see that the knight is still pinned, cannot move away because the bishop on b7 is unprotected. And white could have played a move like queen d2 to connect the rooks. In my opinion, the most sensible continuation. But instead, Nepo decided to drop back with a knight to e2. And this is interesting moment because apparently he's looking for ways to increase the pressure on the knight. And that could be done either by queen d4, bring a rook to the d file, maybe knight c3 at the right moment. So black decided to move the queen to e7. But once again, probably this is an imprecise decision by Ding, as instead it would have been nicer to put a queen on e8, just to be a bit more flexible with your bishop to retain the possibility of bringing the bishop out. Maybe the bishop can come to c5 at some point. If you could swap the dark squared bishops, it will be much easier for the knight to make jumping moves, for instance to e3, but also the queen on e8 keeps an eye on that pawn on a4. Again, little missed opportunity for black. Let's have a look what happened. After queen e7, Nepo played here the move queen d4. Excellent idea. The queen is nicely placed in the center and cannot easily be attacked because, well, with the queen on e8 there could have followed bishop c5, obviously, which is not possible right now. But Ding had a different idea in mind. He played here the move f5, putting pressure on the bishop, and the bishop cannot just go away because the knight on e2 is unprotected. If you would take on d5, that would be an awful mistake because of rook takes d5 and it's black who seizes the initiative with pressure against the queen and against the knight on e2. So obviously you don't want to give up the bishop that easily. But what to do instead? Well, look, there followed the move bishop to g3. It's a counterattack on the rook. And now things are getting really sharp in the center because that rook cannot just go away. If you go to e6, there is bishop takes d5. And thanks to the pin, the knight on e2 can never be taken. In case after bishop takes d5, there is even knight f4, which is a great resource, winning material. So black is forced to make an exchange sacrifice. He got to take on e4, but the question is how? F takes e4, it's a very interesting possibility with the idea that after, let's say, bishop takes e5, there is e takes f3, and if you do take with the rook, then you're an exchange down as black. But queen e6 is an excellent resource, preparing the bishop to get released to c5 to put pressure on the queen and king. The queen on d4 also got to retain control over the bishop. Things are really sharp now. This would have been more or less equal. But instead rook takes e4 was played, which is also very interesting. And now after f takes e4, black has to go for the exchange of queens with queen takes e4. If you do take with the f pawn, it's rook takes c4. You don't want to give up that c pawn that easily. So queen takes pawn, queen takes, f takes. So here we have the following position in which black has a light squared bishop and a pawn for the exchange. And the question is the extra rook of white, is it really valuable? In the game there followed rook fd1, and you can see that Nepo is trying to increase the pressure on the knight, maybe offering the exchange of knights very soon. And he's trying to infiltrate with his rook into black's position. Here, for instance, something like bishop e7 would have been a nice way trying to improve the bishop with the idea to come over to g5 to attack the rook on c1. There are weakened dark squares. There's definitely compensation. Instead, there followed knight b4, which is a plan we have mentioned earlier as well, with the idea that the knight could come into to d3. If the knight lands on d3, we have this wonderful octopus which dominates the rooks. In that case, there are no ways for the rooks to become active. The rook would be hanging, the pawn on b2, it's a weakness as well. So for that reason, white is really fast. Played here the move rook d7 before black gets a chance to go knight d3. So the rook threatens the bishop. But first, we have a bishop check. That's a very useful move because you're questioning the king what it's gonna do. If you would stop the check with bishop f2, there is bishop takes, king takes, and there is this move knight d3, and you win back the exchange. Black is fine. Going with your king to the center would be ideal with the upcoming endgame, but it's not an endgame yet, and black's forces, they are quite dangerous. There are all these ideas to attack the king, maybe to get in knight d3 very quick as well. So instead, the king basically has to go to the side of the board, which is, of course, not ideal, but white is still doing fine. And black still got to solve the problem regarding his bishop. So bishop c6, threatening the rook. And you see that the rook doesn't have that many squares to stay active on the 7th rank. But there is this move rook c7, which does force the exchange of rooks. You cannot just move the rook away from c8 because white also still threatens to take the pawn on c4. So rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, and now it would be possible to take on a4, but that does allow this move rook takes c4. And when pawns are getting exchanged, it will be easier for the rook to become active. Here you see there is massive pressure against black's pieces. So black is recommended to keep the pawn on the board on c4. Bishop d5 played. And now you see that, okay, white has an extra rook, but once again, it's very difficult to infiltrate. If there would be a rook on the 7th and you have, let's say, ideas to put a bishop on e5 and attack the pawn on g7, that would be really great. But right now, white is also struggling to find a way to enter with its rook. Knight c3 is a good move with the idea to take on d5 and eliminate the defender of the pawn on c4. The bishop cannot easily move away because also the pawn on e4 could be hanging. But there is knight d3, counterattack once again. So if you do take the bishop, there is knight takes c1. White goes rook c2. And now, of course, we do something about this bishop. So the bishop comes back to c6. Everything is nicely under control. White would like to attack the pawn on c4, but things are not that simple. In case the knight moves, the bishop can always come back, for instance. And also the pawn on a4 is under threat. So first we have the move a5. And now king to f7 is an excellent idea to activate the king. And now we have a very interesting stage in front of us. Because they followed the move rook e2. Probably this is not the best move. There could have followed instead the move knight e2, attacking the pawn on c4. And if you do protect the pawn with the bishop, now you can play knight f4. And I think this would be an excellent trade for white, because the bishop cannot just move away, because it will be taken, or the pawn on c4 can be taken. So you got to take on f4, and then it's bishop takes f4. At least it's nice for white that the knight on d3 is no longer there. It doesn't obstruct the d-file, so you can try to find a way to activate the rook. White is a bit better, but probably black still has very good drawing chances. But definitely this is what white should have tried instead. But there followed rook e2, attacking the pawn on e4. And now the most precise move for black would have been king e6. What an insane idea to allow white capturing the pawn on e4. But it does require a bit of calculation. After knight takes pawn, bishop takes, rook takes, there is king d5. So white is still a full exchange up, but the rook is under threat. And also the pawn on b2. If you move the rook back to e2, there is bishop d4. And all of a sudden, this pawn on b2 is hanging. And you see that if that pawn is going to be lost, then the c pawn, it's really dangerous. So machines are saying that it's still playable for white. But I would be really scared facing such a passed pawn together with all these active pieces. This was not played by Ding, and instead he went for the move knight to c1, attacking the rook. And objectively, white should just have gone back to c2. And then after knight d3, we basically have the same position in which white could have followed up here with knight e2. That didn't happen. Instead, both players, they made a nervous impression. Game 13. You're playing for the world title. Instead, rook e1 was played, attacking the knight. The knight went back to d3. And after rook e2, the players repeated one more time. And on move 39, they settled for a draw. It's 6.5, 6.5. And, well, even this game, it was not... it was far from perfectly played by both sides. Both players, they made a nervous impression. But that's not really surprising at all. I'm really curious to see what is going to happen in the final game, which is going to be played tomorrow. Same time. This time it will be Ding playing with the white pieces again. And we will see what is going to happen. And of course, if they are making a draw, we will get to see a tiebreak on Sunday. I wish a lot of luck to both players and their teams preparing for this special occasion. I'm going to enjoy the King's Day. I will see you tomorrow with a recap of the final classical game of the World Championships of 2023.